Hello there and welcome. Before you get too comfortable, before you nestle down beneath your duvet or pull your blanket just so, I'd like to invite you, ever so gently, to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you feel inclined, perhaps let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you just now. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together, softly and without hurry. We'll wander quietly through the 19th century, along the quiet corridors of learning and into modest laboratories that once smelled faintly of chalk, soot and vinegar. Tonight, we travel alongside a man whose work touched nearly every corner of modern life, and yet who lived mostly in calm obscurity, immersed in the tiniest workings of the world around him. Not a general nor a statesman, but a careful observer of things unseen. Louis Pasteur, a name now almost commonplace, gently printed on milk bottles and whispered through hospital wards. Yet behind it, a life not filled with flash or acclaim, but rather method, patience, and long hours spent peering through glass and scribbling neat notes by gaslight. He was born in the Jura region of eastern France, surrounded by vines, hills, and the slow rhythm of rural craft. His childhood was quiet, often marked more by solitude than exuberance, and yet this stillness lent itself well to observation. A boy who studied the shapes of leaves and the way light passed through coloured salt crystals, he was not the sort to raise his voice, but rather the sort to linger over small details that others might pass by. Louis Pasteur did not discover a new continent or lead armies to glory. He peered into flasks, observed moulds and microbes, and asked gently persistent questions. And in doing so, he helped usher in the microscopic age of medicine and microbiology. His methods were cautious, his convictions firm, but never arrogant. And so tonight, we'll walk with him, slowly, from the stone streets of Arbois to the lecture halls of Paris, from the fermentation vats of brewers to the sorrowful eyes of a child bitten by a stray dog. We'll move at his pace, patient, measured, a pace perfect for sleep, or at least for soft contemplation. So if you're ready, breathe gently, let your limbs grow heavy, and allow yourself to drift back into a world of candle-lit experiments and handwritten conclusions. In the early days of December 1822, beneath a sky often heavy with winter cloud, in the modest town of Dole in eastern France, Louis Pasteur was born. The Jura region, where Dole and nearby Arbois nestled in gentle seclusion, was not a place of grandeur. Rather, it was a place of quiet industriousness, where life moved according to the rhythms of nature and the seasons, and where the people, often artisans or small-scale farmers, lived closely with the land. Pasteur's father, Jean-Joseph Pasteur, was a tanner by trade. A man of dignity, if not formal learning, he had served as a sergeant major during the Napoleonic Wars, and returned home with a sense of discipline and pride, though no great wealth. His workshop, soaked through with the earthy smells of hides and lime, was one of method and care. It was in such a setting that young Louis began to understand the value of precision, of persistence, and of quiet attention to labour. The creak of leather, the steady rasp of scraping tools, the gentle drip of water, all these sounds formed the backdrop to his earliest memories. The Jura, known for its wines and its undulating vineyards, offered a certain peace. The landscape was shaped by limestone and softened by vines. In the spring, the air was damp with green, the hills gently dusted with blossoms. In the autumn, those same hills turned to gold and rust, the vineyards heavy with ripening grapes. This cycle of growth and decay would become, later in life, an undercurrent in Pasteur's scientific reflections. As a child, Louis was known not for mischief or bravado, but for a serious, sometimes pensive manner. He spent time drawing, not merely doodles, but earnest portraits of family and neighbours, attempts to capture, it seemed, the world just as it appeared. These drawings, many of which survive, were not flamboyant but careful, as though the boy were already training his eye for subtleties. He was not a prodigy, not a child genius by any grand metric, but rather thoughtful, diligent, and quietly observant. The family moved to Arbois not long after his birth, and it was here, amid the soft clink of wine bottles and the scent of must and barrel, that Louis's childhood truly unfolded. Arbois was a town of no great renown, but to those who lived there it was sufficient, a place of hills, slow commerce, and honest work. Life there was slow in the best of ways. Shops opened late and closed early. Market days were social as much as commercial. People knew one another by name and waved from across the street. Young Louis attended the local school, where he was neither the best nor the worst student. His teachers noted his seriousness, his tendency to linger over his lessons longer than most. He seemed to prefer solitude, often retreating into books or drawing rather than play. Still, he was not aloof, simply introspective. His friendships, though few, were deep. He would walk with his companions along the river Cuisance, the gentle water curling around stones, past moss and reeds, past the still figures of fishermen. It was a time of simple joys. Meals at home were modest. Bread, cheese, sometimes a stew. His mother, Jeanne Etiennette, kept a quiet house, her movements purposeful and efficient. The fire burned low in winter, and in summer the windows were thrown open to the scent of flowering herbs. There was not much money, but there was enough, and there was always a sense of striving, not for grandeur, but for improvement, for knowledge, for a life well spent. Around Arbois, the vineyards were more than scenery, they were livelihood. Entire families worked the land, pruning vines, checking the grapes, pressing juice. Pasteur, though not born into a vintner's household, would have watched these rituals with quiet interest. The fermenting barrels in shadowy cellars, the slow alchemy of grape to wine. It was not science to him yet, but it was something elemental, something about change and time and care. Evenings in the Pasteur household were quiet affairs. The family might gather around the fire, the soft crackle of wood providing the only accompaniment to hushed conversation. Louis, often with a sketch pad in hand, might glance occasionally at the firelight dancing across his father's features, committing the shape to paper. He was, even then, a recorder of small truths. Sundays were for mass and for walking. The region offered many paths, up gentle slopes to stone chapels, through forests where light filtered in green shafts, across fields where cattle moved slowly in the distance. These walks were not hurried. There was time to notice the curve of a leaf, the smell of wet earth, the distant hum of insects. One can imagine the young Pasteur trailing slightly behind, lost in thought, picking up a stone, or peering at the way lichen clung to bark. His earliest exposure to science, such as it was, came not from textbooks, but from life. The careful steps of tanning, the chemistry of winemaking, the patience of drawing, the slow change of seasons, all were lessons. There were no laboratories in Arbois, but there was observation, there was craft, and there was a kind of quiet empirical spirit that asked, not loudly but persistently, why? In his adolescence, Louis began to show more academic promise. Encouraged by a few attentive teachers, he applied himself more fully to study. He travelled to Besançon, a nearby town, for secondary education. This marked, in a way, the beginning of a slow departure from the rhythms of Arbois, yet he would return often, and in later years, when his fame grew, he would still retreat to the family home in Arbois for quiet and reflection. But in these earliest years, long before Paris and the Sorbonne, before rabies and germ theory, Louis Pasteur was simply a boy in the vineyards. A boy who watched and drew and listened. A boy who, without knowing it, was learning the virtues that would one day shape a field of science. Patience, observation, and above all, reverence for the quiet complexity of the natural world. In the narrow streets of Arbois, lined with stone houses weathered by time, Louis Pasteur grew into boyhood with a kind of earnest quietude. There was no rush in him, no impatience. He walked at a slow pace, taking in the textured surfaces of shutters, the iron curls of balconies, the drip of water from gutters after rain. His was a world of detail, of noticing. A cobweb spun in the eaves of the town bakery, the way frost formed delicate feathers on the schoolhouse window pane. Even as a boy, he seemed attuned to the minute. The town itself was modest, with its clock tower marking the hours in a bell tone neither harsh nor bright. The river Cuisance meandered nearby, its waters cold and steady, feeding both land and imagination. Along its banks, the young Louis would sometimes wander, his shoes damp with dew, his gaze lingering on moss or the gentle dip of water beetles dancing across the surface. His schooling, at first, was unremarkable. He was no prodigy in the traditional sense. In mathematics, he was slow, but accurate. In reading, deliberate. In Latin, hesitant. Yet there was something in his bearing, a sense of thoroughness, perhaps, that caused certain teachers to look twice. He might take longer to complete an exercise, but when he did, it was often flawless. Not brilliant, not groundbreaking, just quietly correct. Louis's father, Jean-Joseph, was immensely proud of his son. Though of humble background and without formal education, he placed great weight on learning. He had the solemn pride of a veteran, and he viewed knowledge as a form of discipline akin to soldiering. He encouraged Louis, but never pushed. There were no shouts, no threats, only gentle questions and quiet expectation. And so the boy studied. He drew most evenings, and he read. At times he copied diagrams from his school books, other times he sketched portraits from memory, always with the same soft commitment to likeness and detail. His drawings were admired locally, and for a time his teachers and even his family believed he might become an artist. But art, though he loved it, did not satisfy the deeper itch in his nature. He wanted not only to capture appearances, but to understand them. What made colour change in the light? Why did leaves curl as they dried? Why did the air, though invisible, move flames and carry scent? The town of Arbois, too, was a teacher. Its rhythms, slow and seasonal, impressed upon Louis a respect for process. Grapes did not rush to ripen, nor did wines hasten to age. The winemakers, he observed, worked not in flurries, but in sequences. There was pressing, fermenting, decanting. Each step followed another. Mistakes were made when steps were skipped or rushed. It was, in its way, an early lesson in method. Louis was often drawn to the tannery as well. Though the process was pungent and at times unpleasant, he observed his father's work with fascination. The hides, soaked and scraped, softened and dyed, transformed before his eyes. It was not beautiful, not in the traditional sense, but it was a kind of transmutation. The child who watched would, years later, probe more complex forms of transformation, unseen by the eye. His siblings, too, played a part in his upbringing. He was close to his sisters, and their presence brought warmth to the house. Their chatter, their shared chores, their laughter in the small back garden. The Pasteur home was not austere. It was affectionate, in that quiet way families can be when bound more by devotion than by display. At church, Louis was solemn, as most children of the time were. Faith was not questioned, but absorbed. The Latin murmurs, the scent of candle wax and old wood, the echo of steps on stone, these sensory impressions remained with him, and while his later work would shift firmly into the scientific, the structure and ritual of his early religious life seemed to shape his mindset. Order, reverence, humility, these were qualities he never shed. Arbois did not have laboratories. There were no microscopes to peer into, no professors to question. Yet the young Pasteur found in the fields, in the tannery, and in the town square a series of silent experiments. The ripening of fruit, the changing smell of wine, the settling of dust in a beam of light. He did not yet have the tools, but he had the gaze. His first real schooling in chemistry came later, of course, but the foundations were laid in these years. He learned that things change, not at random, but according to patterns. That observation must be slow and recorded carefully. That truth often comes not in flashes, but in the accumulation of small, careful facts. When he was about 13, a local teacher, Monsieur Romanet, noticed his careful nature. Romanet, a man of slender build and scholarly air, took Louis under his wing. He gave him extra assignments, often in the form of small problems in chemistry or geometry, not to accelerate him unduly, but to encourage the boy's natural inclination to dwell on details. It was Romanet who suggested that Louis prepare for the Collège Royal at Besançon, a school that would open more doors than Arbois alone could offer. Jean-Joseph Pasteur, though wary of sending his son away, agreed. It was a turning point, though it did not feel dramatic at the time. There was no fanfare, just a letter, a conversation at the dinner table, and then the slow gathering of belongings into a travel trunk. Yet before his departure, Louis continued to draw, always to draw, portraits of local shopkeepers, neighbours, his sisters, and himself, solemn, young, and slightly bowed. These sketches remain, faded now, but intact. They are perhaps the most intimate window into his young mind, serious, observant, and filled with a certain longing, not for adventure, but for understanding. He left Arbois not as a young man filled with ambition, but as one filled with questions. The town would remain his refuge, his compass. Even as his fame grew, and his experiments reached into realms previously unseen, he would return again and again to its quiet streets, its gentle hills, and the slow murmuring river that had first taught him to watch, to wonder, and to wait. When Louis Pasteur arrived in Besançon in 1839, he was just shy of his 17th birthday. The Collège Royal, a more imposing institution than the schools he had known in Arbois, stood in quiet contrast to the slower rhythms of his hometown. The corridors echoed with the tread of leather shoes, the distant murmur of Latin conjugations, and the sharp scent of ink and chalk dust. Here, young men from various backgrounds converged, sons of lawyers, doctors, merchants, each bringing with them differing aspirations and varying degrees of confidence. Louis, at first, was somewhat adrift. He did not shine immediately. His marks were modest, and he appeared to some as reserved, even shy. Yet those who took the time to observe him saw something deeper, a methodical nature, a kind of internal steadiness. He was never one for spectacle or quick answers. His mind was a slow blooming thing, and in time it would unfurl. While other students might rush through their lessons to reach a cafe or an evening game, Louis lingered. He lingered over essays, over equations, and especially over his beloved drawings. For while his academic subjects sometimes challenged him, the act of drawing remained a constant, steady joy. His pencil lines were neither flamboyant nor hurried. They crept across the page with deliberate care. A curve here, a subtle shadow there. Always patient, always striving for accuracy. He began attending drawing lessons in a more formal setting, guided by instructors who recognized his discipline, if not genius. His portraits became finer, more detailed, yet they also became tools of contemplation. He would spend long hours capturing the angle of a jaw, the downturn of an eye, the quiet fold of a collar. These were not just likenesses. They were studies of presence, of stillness, of attention. But it was not art alone that began to pull at him. In one particular classroom, less vibrant than the art studio, more austere, Louis encountered chemistry in its formal dress. The teacher, whose name has largely faded from history, introduced his students to the fundamentals: acids and bases, reactions and compounds, the peculiar dance of elements. To many, it was a dry subject. To Louis, it was revelation. He began to see connections between the transformations in the tannery, the fermentation in local wine, and the orderly principles described on the blackboard. Chemistry, he realized, was a language for change, a way to describe, with certainty, the processes that had long fascinated him. Where art had shown him surface, chemistry promised a glimpse beneath. He applied himself with increasing fervor. His marks improved. He was not naturally gifted in mathematics, yet through steady effort he began to master it, not for its own sake, but as a key to the chemical world. He started performing small experiments, mostly theoretical at first, but his fascination grew. What caused a substance to change color? Why did heat provoke transformation in some materials, but not others? It was at this time that his mentors began to notice. One professor in particular, Monsieur Barillot, commented on Louis's capacity for concentration. While other students sometimes fidgeted or drifted off, Pasteur would remain entirely still, focused on the problem at hand. He was not seeking glory or applause. He simply wished to understand. Despite his growing interest in science, he did not abandon his drawing. Indeed, the two pursuits seemed to inform one another. In the precision of chemical equations, he saw something akin to line and balance. In the structure of molecules, he imagined the contours of a face, the light fall across a cheek. His notebooks from this time are a curious blend. Chemical formulae beside sketches, experiments mapped out beside careful portraits. To him, these were not separate worlds, but complementary ones. In 1840, he completed his Bachelor of Letters, and shortly thereafter, his Bachelor of Science. It had not been an easy road. Each exam had required labour. Each success had been earned, inch by inch. But he had grown into his mind, as some do, not suddenly, but season by season. He was not loud about it. His letters home were modest, grateful. He thanked his father, always, and reported his progress in a tone devoid of boasting. Around this time, he began preparing for the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, one of the most prestigious institutions in France. Admission was not guaranteed. The competition was fierce, and Louis, though capable, remained dogged rather than dazzling. He travelled to Paris for the preparatory course, only to find himself overwhelmed by the city, by the pace, by the sheer volume of brilliance around him. He fell ill. Homesick and exhausted, he returned to Arbois. It was a retreat, not a surrender. Back in Arbois, the quiet wrapped around him like an old shawl. He rested, walked, drew, spoke with his family. His father, ever the steady presence, said little but understood. The recovery was not dramatic, but slow and sound, and when Louis returned to Besançon, he did so not with shame, but with a renewed sense of clarity. His path was still forward. He would try again. In 1842, he passed the entrance examination for the École Normale with distinction, not at the top of his class, but high enough. And it was there, within those storied walls in Paris, that his scientific journey would begin in earnest. But even then, he was not driven by ambition. He was driven by curiosity, a wish to understand the processes others overlooked, to pay close attention, to draw, not with pencil alone, but with reason. He carried with him to Paris the habits formed in Arbois and Besançon, the long hours, the quiet observation, the steady rhythm of work. He would soon exchange vineyards for laboratories and portraits for crystals, but his method would remain unchanged, always careful, always deliberate, always quietly sure. When Louis Pasteur took up his place at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris in 1843, he entered not just a building of learning, but a world of thought that pulsed with intensity and order. Nestled in the Latin Quarter, surrounded by narrow streets and the chatter of students, the École was both refuge and crucible for young scholars. It bore within its stone walls the weight of intellectual tradition, of structured curiosity, of minds drawn toward the precision of method and the solemnity of truth. The transition was not without discomfort. Though Louis had recovered from his earlier illness, Paris remained vast and noisy to him. The boulevards, the carriages, the flurry of life. It was all somewhat more than he cared for. He found no joy in idle society or the bustle of city entertainment. Instead, he retreated into study, maintaining a gentle distance from distraction. At the École, he was not alone in his seriousness, but few matched him for sheer consistency. His routine, always unhurried, rarely varied. He rose early, took modest meals, and gave his energy fully to study. There was no dramatic spark, no eccentric flair, just discipline, gentle, unwavering discipline. It was during these early years at the École that Pasteur's interest in chemistry began to focus more tightly, narrowing toward the mysterious world of crystals. He was drawn to the field of crystallography, a branch of science not yet fully developed, and one which, at the time, occupied a curious middle ground between physics and chemistry. The way that solids formed, the way they refracted light, the peculiar geometry of their structures, all of this caught his attention. Under the mentorship of Antoine-Jérôme Ballard and Jean-Baptiste Dumas, two well-respected chemists of the period, Pasteur began his work with tartrate crystals. Tartrates were compounds derived from tartaric acid, often found as byproducts in wine fermentation. Their chemical composition was simple enough, but their crystalline forms presented puzzles that had eluded firm explanation. Pasteur approached the problem not with grand theoretical flourishes, but with patient observation. He examined sample after sample under the microscope, drawing them with the same careful hand he had once used for portraits. He noticed something peculiar. Although two samples might appear chemically identical, their crystals bent light in opposing directions. They were, in a sense, mirror images of one another, what would later be understood as optical isomers. His discovery, though modest in appearance, was foundational. It suggested that molecules themselves could possess a kind of handedness, that nature was not always symmetrical. He published his findings cautiously, with the soft confidence of one who does not seek applause, but simply wishes to share a truth. His work caught the attention of leading figures in French science. Slowly, his name began to circulate, not as a prodigy, not as a firebrand, but as a young man of uncommon precision. Despite this growing recognition, Pasteur remained rooted in routine. He lived in modest quarters, took long walks in the quieter corners of Paris, and continued to correspond with his family in Arbois. His father, ever supportive, followed Louis's progress with quiet pride, his letters filled with careful script and warm sentiment. Life at the école was structured. Students attended lectures in the morning, practical demonstrations in the afternoon, and spent evenings in quiet study or laboratory work. The atmosphere was not austere, but respectful. There was a shared reverence for knowledge, and for the careful communal effort of learning. Pasteur, always more at ease with solitude than with society, found his place here. Among the clink of glassware, the odour of reagents, the scribble of chalk on blackboard, he felt at home. It was during this period, too, that he began to teach. He served as a tutor to younger students, guiding them through chemical equations, supervising experiments. He was not flamboyant in the lecture hall. His voice was steady, his explanations deliberate. He was not a man of theatrical gestures, but of quiet authority. His students respected him, if not always affectionately, then certainly earnestly. Outside of the laboratory, Pasteur maintained his drawing. Though less frequent, it remained a comfort. On weekends, when lectures were few, he would sometimes walk along the Seine or into the Jardin de Luxembourg with a small notebook, sketching the outlines of passers-by or the silhouettes of trees against the city sky. These moments of gentle solitude punctuated the rhythm of his scientific work, offering a reminder of his early interests, his inner calm. He also became engaged in broader philosophical questions, not of religion or politics, which he tended to keep at arm's length, but of science itself. He believed in the moral dimension of inquiry, that to study the workings of nature was, in a sense, an act of reverence. He did not see himself as a disruptor, but as a steward, someone tending to knowledge as one might tend to a garden, slowly, carefully, without haste. By 1847, he had earned his doctorate, presenting a thesis that built upon his crystallographic work. It was well received, though not celebrated with great fanfare. But for Pasteur, that was never the goal. The reward was not applause, but understanding. And now he was poised to take his next step, not away from the laboratory, but deeper into it. He remained at the École Normale for a time, as assistant and then professor, but it would not be long before he was called elsewhere. His work had begun to gather quiet weight, and opportunities arose. Opportunities not for fame, but for further, quieter exploration. As his 20s gave way to his 30s, Louis Pasteur was not yet a household name. He had not yet peered into the mystery of germs or stood at the bedside of the afflicted, but he had formed within himself the habits and mindset that would carry him forward. Precision, patience, a certain moral clarity, and above all, a sense that the world, though vast and complex, could be understood, bit by bit, through steady work, clear observation, and a deep, abiding respect for the smallest of truths. As the 1840s folded quietly into the 1850s, Louis Pasteur, now a man of 30, found himself ever more absorbed by the minute structures of the natural world. He had taken up a position at the University of Strasbourg, a city that, with its blend of French and German influences, suited his temperament, calm, scholarly, and quietly industrious. It was here, nestled between the soft sounds of the cathedral bell and the steady hum of academic life, that Pasteur would continue his gentle deepening into the realm of crystals and their elusive secrets. The laboratory was modest by modern standards. A few benches, shelves of labelled flasks, dusty cabinets with reagents in clear glass jars. The light that filtered through the tall windows cast slow-moving patterns on the tiled floor, and in that diffused sunlight, Pasteur could often be found seated before a simple optical instrument, carefully adjusting the angle, turning the specimen gently, scribbling small notes in a steady hand. His work at this time remained focused on molecular asymmetry. He was still pursuing the peculiar observation that certain crystals, although chemically identical, behaved differently when it came to polarized light. He had noted, years earlier, that tartaric acid, derived from grapes and a familiar byproduct in winemaking, bent light in one direction, while a seemingly identical compound, known as paratartaric acid or racemic acid, had no such effect. To most, the difference seemed trivial, perhaps even an error, but Pasteur, ever patient, suspected something more. He hypothesized that the difference might lie not in the substance as a whole, but in the internal arrangement of its molecules, a quiet irregularity, a hidden lopsidedness. He began painstakingly separating the individual crystals of racemic acid using fine tweezers and a magnifying lens. It was the sort of work that most scientists would have found maddeningly tedious. But for Pasteur, it was a kind of meditation. Each crystal was examined, sorted, and placed into one of two piles, those whose structure spiraled to the right and those to the left. In time, he found that when separated, each set of crystals behaved like tartaric acid, one bending light to the right, the other to the left. Only when mixed, their effects cancelled one another out. It was a quiet revelation. Pasteur had demonstrated that molecules could exist as mirror images, what would later be called enantiomers. This was not merely an esoteric finding. It hinted at something profound, that life itself might prefer one orientation over another. That asymmetry, often dismissed as a flaw, was in fact a fundamental aspect of living systems. He presented his findings modestly, with diagrams and cautious language. There was no grand unveiling, no rapturous applause, but those within the scientific community took note. Here was a man who had not only solved a long-standing puzzle, but had done so through patience, discipline, and an eye for detail that bordered on the monastic. Pasteur continued to explore this idea of asymmetry. He speculated, correctly as it would later turn out, that many organic compounds produced by living organisms favoured a single molecular orientation. Life, it seemed, was not a mirror but a one-way path, winding gently in a preferred direction. Outside the laboratory, life in Strasbourg followed a slow, familiar rhythm. Pasteur married Marie Laurent, the daughter of the university's rector, in 1849. She was intelligent, kind, and equally attentive to detail. Their letters from this time show a gentle affection, a partnership not of grand passion, but of mutual respect and shared commitment. Marie would become a crucial part of Pasteur's life, his sounding board, his confidant, and, in time, his staunch defender. They lived modestly, as academics often did, in a home not far from the university grounds. Their household was quiet, orderly. Meals were simple, but taken together, and their evenings were often spent in shared reading or conversation. Louis, though often absorbed in his work, made time for his growing family. He was a tender father, cautious with his children, protective even, yet he rarely spoke of emotion directly. His love was shown in small gestures, in presence, in quiet care. In Strasbourg, he also began mentoring students. He was not a charismatic lecturer, but he was clear, consistent, and deeply attentive. He expected much from those he taught. not brilliance, but care. He encouraged them to draw their observations, to record every deviation, to repeat experiments not once or twice, but until they were certain. Some found his demands excessive. Others, particularly those of a more methodical mind, found in him a rare kindred spirit. Meanwhile, his work on crystals continued to ripple outward. Though he had no interest in fame, his discoveries earned him an invitation to the Académie des Sciences in Paris. This, for a provincial scholar, was no small recognition, and yet he accepted it with quiet modesty, returning each evening not to salons or banquets, but to his microscope, to his notebooks, to his rows of sorted crystals. In time, his interests would shift from the solid world of crystals to the living, teeming world of microbes. But even then, the habits he formed during these Strasbourg years, the careful observation, the respect for hidden structure, the belief that the smallest details could hold the greatest truths, would remain his guiding lights. And so, in the stillness of the Strasbourg laboratory, surrounded by dust and light and the silent order of his tools, Louis Pasteur carried on, patiently, quietly, drawing truth from crystal, and laying, unknowingly, the foundation for a new science that would, in time, change the world, not with noise or speed, but with gentle, deliberate care. By the mid-1850s, Louis Pasteur's path began to turn quietly, almost imperceptibly, from the hard edges of crystallography toward the softer, less clearly defined realm of living change. He had accepted a post at the University of Lille, a city steeped in industry, where smoke rose steadily from chimneys and the rhythm of the town beat in time with the machinery of textile mills and breweries. It was not a place of romance or leisure. It was a working city where the concerns of the day were practical, and science, if it had a place, was meant to serve. It was here that Pasteur, now a respected chemist, was asked to assist a local distillery with a rather ordinary problem. The fermentation of beetroot alcohol, used in spirits and industrial products, was behaving unpredictably. Sometimes the vats would bubble as expected, and sweet alcohol would flow. At other times, they would sour. The process would fail. The taste would go wrong. The profit would vanish. The cause was unclear. Pasteur, as always, did not leap to conclusions. He did not dismiss the matter as trivial, nor did he approach it with disdain. Instead, he visited the factory, observed the workers, stood near the steaming vats. He took samples and returned to his small laboratory, where light streamed through the windows in familiar patterns, and began to observe. With a microscope, an instrument he now used more and more, he peered into the cloudy liquids. What he saw was not chaos, but life. Tiny structures, moving. Yeasts, he would later call them. Living organisms, invisible to the naked eye, but clearly present. He studied them with the same deliberate care he had once given to crystals, sketching their shapes, noting their presence in samples from successful and failed fermentations. The conclusion came slowly, but it came. Fermentation, he realized, was not a chemical reaction alone, but a biological one. It was carried out by living cells, yeasts, that consumed sugars and produced alcohol, and when the process failed, it was often because other microbes, unwanted, unseen, had entered the mix, corrupting the outcome. Decay, spoilage, souring, these were not mysteries or spontaneous afflictions. They were the work of life, microscopic life. It was a radical idea, though Pasteur never framed it with drama. He presented it gently, supported by drawings, observations, and replicable experiments. He was not seeking to overturn theories or provoke argument. He merely wished to show what he had seen. At the time, the prevailing theory, known as spontaneous generation, held that life could arise from non-life, that a broth left to stand would generate living organisms simply because of some innate force. Pasteur doubted this, not with arrogance, but with the cautious skepticism of a man who trusts only what he can see and test. He devised a series of experiments now considered among the most elegant in science. Using flasks with long, curved necks, so-called swan neck flasks, he showed that boiled broth remained clear and free of life so long as air could enter, but dust and particles could not. If the neck was broken, exposing the broth to airborne matter, microbes appeared. If not, the broth remained sterile. Life, he showed, did not arise from nothing. It travelled unseen with dust and air. This simple yet careful demonstration caused quiet ripples. It challenged long-held beliefs, not with rhetoric, but with clarity. Pasteur had no interest in antagonizing those who disagreed. He simply returned to his laboratory, to his notes, and continued. Back in Lille, his work began to bear practical fruit. He advised brewers and distillers to monitor cleanliness, to cover their vats, to consider not just ingredients, but the invisible environment. Slowly, success rates improved. Losses diminished. Pasteur had earned the respect not only of scholars, but of workers, men and women whose livelihoods depended on the dependable transformation of sugar to alcohol. These were not glamorous victories, but they were the kind he cherished, real, grounded, quietly transformative. His lectures from this period began to reflect his evolving thought. He spoke more often of germs and microbes, words that at the time carried little meaning for most. He explained that living organisms, though too small to see, could cause change, illness, and decay, not through mystery but through biology. The world, he was suggesting, was far more alive than it appeared. His manner of speech was steady, considered. He used no flourishes, made no bold declarations. His voice, recorded by students, was low and deliberate. He preferred chalk to flourish, diagrams to drama. In his quieter moments back at home, he would discuss his thoughts with Marie. Their evenings were often spent at the dining table, reviewing correspondence, discussing letters from students and colleagues. Marie, intelligent and practical, helped him sort his ideas, offering a listener's ear and a calm counterpoint to his growing workload. Their children, still young, were kept close. There were walks, simple meals, a kind of stillness that suited him well. And yet, behind that stillness, something was shifting. The germ theory of life, and eventually disease, was beginning to take form. Pasteur, ever the careful observer, never rushed to conclusions. But with each experiment, each flask, each observation under the lens, his confidence grew. He began to see connections between fermentation and putrefaction, the spoiling of wine, the souring of milk, the rotting of flesh. Each bore the signature of microbial activity. Each could, perhaps, be understood, prevented, even reversed, not through magic, but through care. And so, the man who had once sorted tiny crystals by hand now turned his gaze toward even smaller things. The yeast cells, the bacterial spores, the invisible agents of change. In them, he saw not chaos, but pattern, not fear, but opportunity. Fermentation, once a mystery, was becoming a science. Decay, once inevitable, was becoming preventable. And Louis Pasteur, quiet and meticulous, continued his work, shaping one slow discovery at a time, the dawn of a new understanding. In the quiet hills of southern France, near the towns of Alès and Montpellier, rows of mulberry trees once rustled gently in the breeze. Beneath their shade, in orderly rows of stone-built sheds, countless silkworms inched along beds of leaves, their delicate bodies soft and pale, their existence confined to the slow rhythm of feeding and molting. For generations, these small creatures had provided the lifeblood of a region, spinning in their final days the fine, glistening threads that would become the silks of Lyon and beyond. But by the mid-1860s, something was wrong. The silkworms were dying. France, already strained by political tension and economic shifts, now faced a crisis of industry. Entire families depended upon sericulture, the raising of silkworms, for their livelihood. Yet the worms, once so reliable, had begun to weaken. Their bodies blackened, their cocoons failed to form properly, and mortality spread through the farms like a whisper of illness. Attempts to salvage the harvest only deepened the losses. Local experts were perplexed. Remedies were tried. Changing temperatures, shifting diets, altering the timing of feedings, but none succeeded. The disease, or perhaps diseases, persisted. Farmers and officials alike grew desperate. The government, aware of the mounting concern, sought help. And it was to Louis Pasteur, now recognized for his careful studies of fermentation, that they turned. Pasteur was not by any traditional measure a biologist. He had never studied silkworms. His work had been with crystals, with fermentation, with yeasts and bacteria, but the principles he applied, observation, documentation, methodical testing, could be applied to any problem, no matter how unfamiliar. He accepted the task not with excitement, but with solemn resolve. He saw it not as a challenge to his expertise, but as a call to service. In 1865, he travelled to the south of France, accompanied by Marie and several assistants. The journey was long, and the air, thick with dust and the scent of livestock, was a contrast to the stone laboratories of Paris. But Pasteur adapted, setting up temporary labs near the silkworm farms, donning simple clothes, and joining the rhythm of the farmers' days. He began, as always, by observing. Hour after hour, he watched the worms as they fed, molted, and died. He collected samples, dead worms, diseased leaves, feces, and uneaten food. He examined them under the microscope, peering into the soft tissues for signs of abnormality. He noted that some worms bore dark spots, as though stained from within. Others appeared sluggish and pale. From the beginning, he suspected that multiple diseases were at play. One, already suspected by some, was pebrine, a parasite visible as tiny, dark granules within the worm's body. But Pasteur believed there was another distinct illness, which he would later call flasherie. It presented differently. A softening, a loss of coordination, a kind of internal collapse. His approach was slow, meticulous. He followed the threads of evidence like one might follow a faint trail through the forest. Each step was recorded, each failure noted, and through it all he was present among the farmers, not aloof, but attentive. He asked questions, listened, and encouraged the simplest of methods, separating the healthy from the diseased, observing the lineage of moths and maintaining cleanliness with unwavering care. He devised a testing procedure, examining moths before they were allowed to reproduce. If the parasite was visible under the microscope, the moths were culled. If not, their eggs could be used. It was slow work, requiring patience from both scientists and farmers, but gradually the health of the worms improved. The epidemic, though not fully vanquished, was brought under control. Pasteur's findings were published and distributed among sericulturists, not as abstract theory, but as a guide, a manual of practice. He stressed not innovation, but vigilance. The solutions were not magical, but methodical. Examine each generation, discard the infected, maintain cleanliness, and above all, observe. His work with silkworms, though less celebrated than his later triumphs, was perhaps among the most human. It placed him among ordinary people facing ruin, and it called upon not just his intellect, but his empathy. In the letters he wrote from the south, he spoke of the toll the disease had taken, not in numbers, but in faces. He saw the lines of worry etched into the brows of farmers, the way their hands trembled when speaking of another failed harvest. For Pasteur, the episode reaffirmed a truth he had long suspected, that science was not a thing apart, to be housed only in the minds of experts and the walls of academies. It was a tool of care, a way of seeing, a method by which sorrow could be lessened and confusion calmed. He left the south with little fanfare. The mulberry trees still rustled, the sheds still stood, but within them now were farmers equipped not just with hope, but with knowledge. And while the silkworms remained delicate, their fate was no longer left entirely to chance. Back in Paris, Pasteur resumed his work, a little older, a little slower, but no less precise. The silkworm crisis had reminded him that even the smallest creatures could hold within them the weight of a nation, and that sometimes salvation came not through bold discovery, but through quiet, deliberate observation. In the subdued corridors of his laboratory at the École Normale Supérieure, Louis Pasteur returned to a subject that had long simmered in his mind: microbes and their subtle, persistent roles in both the processes of life and the afflictions of the body. The silkworm crisis had reinforced for him the quiet influence of the invisible. Now he turned that same methodical gaze to human health, and to a question that lingered among physicians and scientists alike: what caused disease? For centuries, illness had been ascribed to imbalances of humour, to miasmas, to vague and shifting influences in the air. Physicians worked by custom and instinct, treating symptoms as they appeared. Surgery, when attempted, was carried out swiftly and without understanding of contamination. In hospitals, wounds festered. Mothers and infants died in alarming numbers. And yet the air smelled clean and the water seemed clear. Pasteur, with his swan-neck flasks and his quiet logic, had already shown that microbes existed in the air, riding invisibly on dust and breath. Now he began to ask, could these same tiny organisms, so vital in the making of wine and the spoiling of milk, also cause the putrefaction of flesh, and perhaps even the sickness of man? He approached the question cautiously. He was not a physician, nor a surgeon. He did not claim to heal, but he could demonstrate with care the conditions under which decay took place, and the means by which it could be prevented. His experiments were simple in design, yet profound in implication. He would boil broth in flasks to destroy all existing life, then seal some and leave others open to the air. The sealed flasks remained clear, the open ones clouded with microbial growth. The conclusion, repeated over and over, was that contamination came not from within, but from without. At the time, some doctors scoffed. The idea that invisible life could invade the body and cause suffering seemed fanciful. Yet a handful listened. In Scotland, a surgeon named Joseph Lister took note of Pasteur's work and began applying his ideas to the operating theatre. He cleaned instruments, sterilized wounds with carbolic acid, and found that infection rates dropped markedly. Where once amputation was a near-certain death sentence, it now became survivable. Lister acknowledged Pasteur openly. The connection between the French chemist and the Scottish surgeon was not forged in person, but in shared understanding. It was a meeting of minds, bridged by observation and trust. Meanwhile, Pasteur continued his studies. He examined anthrax, a disease that devastated cattle and sometimes affected humans. Working in a quiet village laboratory in Pouilly-le-Fort, He conducted experiments to test whether animals could be protected, vaccinated against the illness. He prepared a weakened strain of the anthrax microbe and administered it to sheep. Some were left untreated. When later exposed to the virulent form, the vaccinated sheep lived, the others did not. The experiment was repeated publicly before farmers, veterinarians, and officials. The demonstration was not theatrical. Pasteur's manner remained quiet, almost reluctant. He did not boast. He simply stated the facts, that disease could be caused by microbes and that protection could be achieved by introducing a gentler form beforehand. The principle of vaccination, known in part since Jenner's work with smallpox, had now been extended, clarified, and demonstrated anew. In Paris, the Institut Pasteur was established not as a monument to a man, but as a centre for continued research. Pasteur himself worked tirelessly, his body beginning to show the wear of his efforts. He had suffered a stroke in 1868, which left one side of his body weakened, yet he continued, often working long hours, supported by Marie and a growing team of loyal assistants. He rarely travelled, and when he did, it was out of duty. Invitations to lecture abroad were declined more often than accepted. Fame, though it came to him, did not distract him. His focus remained the same: careful experimentation, honest reporting, and the steady widening of human understanding. The concept of germs, of living causes behind disease, began to take hold, not through decree, but through repetition, through slow, consistent proof. Hospitals began to adopt antiseptic procedures. Public health campaigns, grounded in Pasteur's findings, began to promote cleanliness, the boiling of drinking water, the sterilization of medical tools. Pasteur never claimed to have all the answers. He spoke rarely in the first person. His publications were models of restraint, filled with data, observations, and gentle deductions. He did not seek to frighten, nor to elevate. He sought only to explain. In his personal life, he remained deeply private. He had suffered personal loss. 3 of his 5 children died young, likely from infections he would later understand in far greater detail. These losses, deeply felt, though rarely spoken of, added a quiet urgency to his work, not for recognition, but for prevention, for the protection of others. In the final years of this chapter, Pasteur's thoughts returned often to the simplicity of his method. He once remarked that science advances not by great leaps, but by careful steps, each one taken in full light, on solid ground. He believed in the morality of science, that its purpose was to lessen suffering, to ease fear, to illuminate the unknown. And so, the quiet war against germs, once a murmur on the edge of science, became a new foundation. Hospitals grew safer, lives, once routinely lost to fever and infection, were preserved. The world, still vast and unpredictable, had grown just a little more knowable. And at the heart of it, seated once again at his laboratory bench, hands steady despite age and illness, Louis Pasteur continued his work, not with triumph, but with peace. For he had seen the invisible, listened to the silent, and in doing so had changed the rhythm of life itself. In the later years of his career, Louis Pasteur found himself once again immersed in the quiet concerns of everyday life, though now with a far-reaching reputation and a laboratory at his command. His investigations had already altered the course of medicine, but there remained simple, lingering questions that affected the lives of common folk as surely as they did great institutions. Chief among these was spoilage, the gentle but relentless turning of milk to sourness, wine to vinegar, and beer to waste. France's winemakers in particular were in distress. In the warm months, barrels of wine would spoil, their surfaces clouded with film, their scent soured, their clarity lost. Vineyards suffered not from poor harvests, but from unpredictable spoilage after bottling. For many, this meant financial ruin. The wine, once drawn and sealed, seemed to fall victim to unseen forces. Pasteur, now in his 50s, responded not with grandeur, but with his familiar calm. He accepted the invitation to study the problem, not as a grand commission, but as another question to be approached with care. He travelled to the vineyards of the south, to the cool, stone-walled wine cellars of Arbois and Beaune, and there began to observe. He drew samples, inspected barrels, and studied the cloudy films that spread across wine left too long exposed. Under the microscope, the culprits revealed themselves, tiny microbes, different from those found in fermentation, but no less alive. These stray invaders consumed the sugars and alcohol, producing sourness, cloudiness, and ruin. The solution, as ever, was not to destroy the wine's essence, but to preserve it. Pasteur knew that boiling killed microbes, but wine could not be boiled outright. It would ruin the delicate balance of flavour and aroma. So he devised a gentler process, heating the liquid to a moderate temperature, just enough to eliminate the harmful organisms without altering the wine's character. This technique, simple in appearance, came to bear his name, pasteurization. It was not an invention as such, but a refinement, a careful balance between destruction and preservation. By heating wine, and later beer and milk, to around 60 to 70 degrees Celsius for a short time, the offending microbes could be subdued without damaging the substance itself. He demonstrated the process with care, recording the changes, testing each batch. The winemakers, though skeptical at first, soon adopted the method. Their losses declined, exports improved. What had once seemed a mysterious blight was now manageable, and Pasteur once more had taken a domestic problem and turned it into a scientific solution. Milk, too, came under his gaze. Though not at first the subject of inquiry, it soon followed naturally. Milk, so vital to children and the infirm, often carried illness. In towns and cities, cases of tuberculosis and typhoid fever were traced to unboiled milk. Pasteur applied the same principle. Gentle heating to reduce microbial content. The result was safer milk, more stable, more predictable. This work, though lacking the drama of his vaccine studies, was in some ways more profound. It touched the home directly. It protected the young and the vulnerable. It did not cure, but it prevented. And in so doing, it marked a shift in the role of science, from the reactive to the protective. Pasteur never made wealth from pasteurization. He did not patent the method nor attach conditions to its use. His interest lay in its adoption, in its capacity to prevent loss and illness. The simplicity of it appealed to his nature. Clean vessels, steady temperatures, and careful timing. As the method spread, first through France, then across Europe and into America, the name Pasteur became quietly embedded in daily life. Milk bottles bore the term. Brewing manuals included it. Yet the man himself remained much the same, reserved, deliberate, and focused. He continued to work from the Institut Pasteur, surrounded by students and assistants, many of whom he mentored with quiet intensity. He remained a teacher, not just in lectures, but in conduct. His laboratory, though filled now with modern instruments, retained the air of discipline he had cultivated since his earliest days. Clean benches, clear notes, respect for method. His health, however, was not what it had once been. The effects of his earlier stroke lingered. He walked more slowly, his left side stiffened, his gestures reduced. but his mind remained sharp. He would sit for long periods, contemplating data, writing in small, neat script, correcting proofs. He rarely travelled, but received visitors warmly. Politicians, physicians, foreign scholars, many sought him out. He welcomed them with gentleness, but steered conversations always back to work, to questions, to facts. In his correspondence, Pasteur rarely dwelt on personal matters, but one senses, between the lines, a quiet satisfaction in the practical impact of his work. When he wrote of wine preserved or milk made safe, his tone was more than scientific. It was humane. He did not see science as a ladder to renown. For him, it was a service, a calling, perhaps, a way to reduce suffering, to ease labour, to clarify the cloudy places of life. Pasteurization, with its calm logic and gentle warmth, reflected his ethos. It asked not for admiration, but for application. And so, in the slow afternoons of his later years, Louis Pasteur could be found at his desk or beside a softly bubbling water bath, monitoring temperatures, watching the change, not seeking the next great discovery, but ensuring that the last was properly understood. For in the end, he believed that knowledge was not an achievement to be hoarded, but a light to be tended. And through the steady heat of pasteurization, he had given the world a way not only to preserve its wine and milk, but to preserve health, trust, and the quiet dignity of daily life. By the early 1880s, Louis Pasteur was no longer an obscure figure working in silence. His name had become softly spoken in laboratories, hospitals, and homes alike. He had brought light to the realm of the unseen, quieted the spectre of spoiled wine and sickly silk, and instilled in many a gentle faith in science as a means not of spectacle, but of protection. Yet one disease, fierce and mysterious, loomed on the edge of the known: rabies. Rabies was a thing of dread. Unlike cholera or smallpox, it was rare, but when it struck, it did so with merciless intensity. A bite from a rabid dog or wolf set off a slow, horrifying descent. Fever, confusion, and then the infamous hydrophobia, the agonizing fear of water, which gripped the throat and lungs with cruel spasms. Death, when it came, was certain and terrible. There was no cure. Once symptoms began, nothing could be done. Physicians stood helpless. Families watched in fear. Pasteur, ever drawn to the border between mystery and method, began to consider whether even this ancient fear might be turned aside, not with strength, but with care. Though not a physician himself, Pasteur approached the problem through the only path he trusted: observation, experimentation, and time. He began to study the disease in animals, especially dogs and rabbits. Using specimens drawn from infected brains, he began to trace the path of the disease through the nervous system. It did not stay in the blood or the muscles. It moved inward to the spinal cord, to the brain, slowly and fatally. It was not a microbe in the visible sense. Unlike bacteria, which could be stained and seen under a microscope, rabies left no obvious trace. Its cause was invisible to the tools of the time. Yet Pasteur deduced its presence through effect. He observed incubation periods. He tracked symptoms. He inferred. His goal, quietly but firmly, became the development of a vaccine, not one given after birth, like Jenner's smallpox protection, but one that might be administered after exposure, in the narrow window before symptoms began. It was a bold idea. That one might, in essence, race the disease, outrun it within the body, and guide the immune system to mount a defense before it was too late. Using rabbits, he cultivated a weakened form of the virus, weak enough not to cause full-blown illness, but potent enough to train the body's defenses. It was a delicate process, involving the drying of infected neural tissue over many days. Each day's sample had a different potency, forming a ladder from weak to strong. This ladder would, he hoped, lead a bitten person to immunity. His experiments progressed cautiously. Animals vaccinated in this way resisted the disease, but the leap to human application was no small thing. Pasteur hesitated. He knew the weight of such a step. That step came in July of 1885. A 9-year-old boy from Meurthe-et-Moselle, Joseph Meister, had been bitten repeatedly by a rabid dog. The bites were severe. His local doctors, helpless, brought him to Paris, brought him to Pasteur. The boy's mother pleaded. The boy, pale and frightened, bore the wounds in silence. Pasteur consulted with his colleagues. He was not licensed to treat patients. He was a chemist, not a physician, but to do nothing was, in effect, to let the child die. He made his decision quietly, after long thought. The boy was given the vaccine, first the weakest preparation, then progressively stronger doses over 10 days. Pasteur watched carefully. There was fever, but no sign of the disease taking hold. Days passed, then weeks. The boy survived. The relief in Pasteur's notes is muted, but real. He recorded the details, not with triumph, but with deep, quiet resolve. The vaccine, tentative as it was, had worked. News spread. Other cases followed. Children, adults, farm workers, shepherds, even those bitten by stray wolves. Many came to Paris. The inoculations continued. The mortality rate fell. Rabies, though not eliminated, was no longer a certain death sentence. A fearful shadow had been softened. Pasteur's work was hailed across the world. Awards were offered. Letters poured in. Yet he remained steady, unflustered. He focused on refining the process, training others, and preparing his findings for publication. He corresponded with doctors, answered questions from officials, and planned for a facility to carry on the work. That facility would become the Institut Pasteur, formally inaugurated in 1888. It was not merely a monument to one man, but a place of continuing study. Laboratories, lecture rooms, a library. It became a quiet hub of international collaboration. Scientists from many nations came to study there, drawn not by grandeur, but by the spirit of careful, steady inquiry. In those final years, Pasteur's physical strength waned. His gait was slow, his speech at times halting, yet he continued to mentor, to observe, to be present. He would sit in the garden of the institute, shaded by trees, listening to the voices of younger researchers, occasionally offering a word or a nod. The rabies vaccine remained a crowning achievement, not for the complexity of the science, but for the humanity it reflected. Pasteur had stared into the fearful unknown and responded not with spectacle, but with structure, not with certainty, but with method. He never spoke of victory. His words remained humble. He once said, "I am on the edge of mysteries, and the veil is getting thinner." Even then, he saw science not as conquest, but as careful unfolding. And so, with each life saved from rabies, each letter of thanks, each parent's quiet relief, the work continued, not loud, not swift, but steady, as always. The story of Joseph Meister, the boy from Meurthe-et-Moselle, became one of the gentler legends in the quietly echoing halls of medical history, not because it was sensational, but because it was so simply human. He was a child of no particular note, the son of a baker, living in a village that seldom made news. His family's life had been marked by routine, loaves baked at dawn, errands run through cobbled streets, evenings spent at the hearth. And then, one July day in 1885, a rabid dog entered that routine and shattered it. The animal attacked with frightening persistence. It bit Joseph several times, on the hand, the thigh, the back. The wounds were deep, torn and bleeding. The dog was caught and killed, but there was little doubt of its madness. Joseph's mother, panic welling in her voice, sought help. The village doctor could offer only a diagnosis, not a cure. Rabies, once contracted, was fatal. There was nothing to be done. Yet the doctor, having read of Pasteur's work, suggested one faint hope. The boy could be taken to Paris. It was not a short journey, nor an easy one. The Meisters travelled by carriage and then train, Joseph groggy with pain and fear, his mother quietly frantic. They arrived at Pasteur's door in the Rue d'Ulm, not with ceremony, but with desperation. Pasteur, aged 62 at the time, received them without flourish. He listened, examined the wounds, considered. The vaccine he had prepared was ready in principle, but had never been used in a human case. His colleagues advised caution. If the boy died under his care, the consequences, legal, reputational, could be severe. But Pasteur thought not of lawsuits or honours. He thought of the boy, pale and silent, looking at him with uncertain trust. He decided quietly to proceed. The treatment began that very evening. Over the course of 10 days, Joseph was given injections, each with progressively stronger preparations of the attenuated virus. Pasteur, though he was not the one to administer the injections, supervised every stage. He watched for fever, for signs of inflammation, for the terrible symptoms of the disease, but none came. The boy improved steadily. Appetite returned, sleep came more easily, and at last he was declared well. The news reached the newspapers, not with fanfare, but as a cautious success. A child, bitten multiple times, had survived. He had been spared the most feared of deaths. Pasteur's vaccine, until then a guarded experiment, now stood before the world as a promise, a suggestion that not all fatal things must remain so. Joseph returned home. The bakery resumed its quiet rhythm. But life had altered. The family was no longer anonymous. Letters arrived. Visitors came. The village spoke of Pasteur in tones of hushed reverence. And Joseph, still just a boy, bore the odd weight of survival. Pasteur himself wrote little about the episode, at least in personal terms. In his notes, the matter is described with the same measured phrasing he always used. Observations recorded, dates and symptoms listed. But in his private manner, one senses something deeper. He was not a man given to sentimentality, yet this case, and the others that followed, clearly moved him. He had not just explained nature, he had intervened. Following Joseph's treatment, others came. A shepherd bitten by a rabid wolf, a young girl scratched by a stray dog. Pasteur did not rush. Each case was assessed individually, and the vaccine, refined and improved, continued to prove effective. The Institut Pasteur, soon to be constructed, would be built in part with funds from grateful families across the world. Donations came from Europe, from America, even from Russia. They came not from governments alone, but from ordinary people, farmers, teachers, parents. As for Joseph Meister, his life settled into a different rhythm. As a young man, he returned to Paris, where Pasteur offered him a post at the very institute that bore his name. Joseph became the gatekeeper, a quiet, reliable presence at the entrance. Day after day, he opened the door to researchers, scholars, and visitors. He did not speak often of his history, but all knew it. He carried it with a quiet dignity. Pasteur would often see him, passing by with a nod, or exchanging a few words. Their relationship, unspoken and deep, became a symbol of the bridge between knowledge and care, between research and life. As Pasteur aged, his own health faltered further. Yet he drew comfort, it seems, from the presence of those he had helped. Not in grand celebrations, but in the ordinary moments. letters from the cured, visits from those who remembered. He knew, more than most, the fragile line that separates life from death, and he had found, in his methodical way, a means to tip the balance, just enough. In the years after Pasteur's death, Joseph continued his work. He lived through wars, bore witness to upheavals. In the Second World War, he remained loyal to the Institute, even as the world around him grew unsteady. The tale of Joseph Meister, small, quiet, and often overshadowed by larger events, remained a thread in the fabric of Pasteur's legacy. Not the story of a miracle, but of intervention, of care, of one man's willingness to act on knowledge, not for glory, but for life. And in that simple act, offering protection where there had been none, Pasteur gave science its most human face. By the late 1880s, Louis Pasteur's name had drifted gently beyond the walls of science. No longer simply the quiet chemist of Arbois or the cautious biologist of Strasbourg, he had come to represent, in the minds of many, the promise of modernity itself, a figure who could tame invisible dangers with method and modesty. Yet he remained always rooted in the quiet. His presence, even in the most elevated circles, was subdued. Among those circles was the French government itself. The President of the Republic, intrigued by Pasteur's discoveries and mindful of the public's reverence for him, made an unusual offer. A laboratory, modest but well-equipped, would be installed within the grounds of the Élysée Palace, the seat of executive power in France. Not as a gesture of prestige, but to allow Pasteur, whose health was faltering, to continue his work closer to the centre of support and resources. Pasteur accepted the arrangement, not for grandeur, but for practicality. He had suffered another stroke, and though his mind remained alert, his body had grown weaker. Long walks to the Institute were becoming burdensome. The Élysée, with its calm gardens and discreet staff, offered a gentle setting, quiet, private, and adequately furnished. The laboratory was simple. A few long tables, cupboards of glassware, a water bath, several microscopes, and shelves of labelled samples. Here, within the elegant hush of the palace walls, Pasteur resumed his experiments. They were no longer the ambitious studies of earlier years, but quiet investigations, confirmations of past work, refinements, small questions pursued without urgency. He rose early, as always, and made his way with care to the laboratory. Dressed plainly, his gait assisted now by a cane, he would sit at his table beneath the tall windows, letting the morning light fall across his papers. Assistants came and went, loyal students who now served as colleagues. They prepared solutions, tended to samples, read aloud passages from recent journals. Pasteur listened, asked precise questions, made notes in his small, tidy hand. Visitors were received infrequently. Dignitaries from abroad requested audiences, and sometimes he would agree, though never for long, and only if the visitor understood that conversation would remain rooted in fact, not flattery. Kings, scholars, and industrialists sat across from him, often speaking more than he did. Pasteur listened, nodding politely, occasionally offering a thought or a question that revealed his enduring clarity. The president himself would sometimes visit, not ceremoniously but informally, asking how the work progressed, how Pasteur found the palace surroundings. Pasteur replied with gratitude, but remained focused. He did not permit political entanglement. For him, science was neither ally nor opponent of government. It was apart, separate, steady, and self-correcting. In those days, he found a kind of peace. The noise of acclaim had faded into the distance. The public, still reverent, no longer crowded around his door. He was free to think slowly again. He spoke often of the early days, of arbois, of the first experiments with crystals, of the simplicity of a swan neck flask. His memory held these things not as trophies, but as trusted companions, moments that had shaped him quietly. Marie, ever near, helped him in ways large and small. She arranged his papers, corrected his drafts, guided guests, and ensured the laboratory remained just as he liked it, neither too busy nor too quiet. Their partnership, rooted in shared purpose rather than performance, endured with soft strength. She knew when to speak and when not to, when to leave him to thought and when to remind him gently of the hour. Meals were taken simply, often in a quiet dining room not far from the laboratory. Pasteur ate slowly with gratitude, never indulgently. He drank only modestly. Wine, of course, and always inspected for clarity and scent. Conversation, if any, was soft and factual. No speculation, no politics, only observations. About weather, about the growth of a mould in a sample, about the reading of a recent paper from Berlin or Edinburgh. From time to time, letters arrived, packets of gratitude, queries from young scientists, proposals from universities abroad. Pasteur read them all. Some he answered directly, others he passed on to his assistants. But each was considered, and each handled with care. His moments of reflection grew longer. Sometimes he would sit near the window, looking out into the gardens, watching as the leaves turned from green to gold, as Paris shifted from summer to autumn. In those moments, he was not working, but he was not idle. His mind, shaped by decades of observation, continued to move gently across the landscapes of thought. He once said, in passing, that science was the search for truth in a world that rarely offers certainty, that its reward was not applause, but clarity. He held no belief in final answers, only in better questions and more careful ways of asking them. The laboratory at the Élysée became, in time, less a place of discovery than of quiet confirmation, but it served its purpose. It gave him space, dignity, and light, and in that space, Louis Pasteur, now an old man, continued his work, not as a symbol, but as a scientist. There were no great declarations, no final revelations, just quiet progress, soft reflections, and the gentle rhythm of a life spent in the pursuit of the invisible. The tall grey buildings of the Sorbonne, weathered by time and thick with the memory of generations, became one of Louis Pasteur's final formal abodes in the world of science. He was offered an honorary suite of rooms there, not for duties performed, but for who he had become, a living symbol of reason, discipline, and the quiet dignity of inquiry. He did not teach lectures now, nor lead laboratories. Instead, he resided gently, like a grandfather to the institution, his presence more felt than seen, more spoken of than loudly displayed. He spent his days not in grand exertion, but in modest continuation. The rhythm of his mornings remained unchanged, a slow rise, assisted where necessary, a light breakfast, and a measured walk through the courtyard, when weather permitted. He dressed carefully, always with a clean collar, a simple black coat, and a hat that shaded his face but did not hide it. His left side remained partially paralyzed from his earlier stroke, but he moved with dignity, his right hand still deft, still capable of writing and pointing with precision. The Sorbonne, with its quiet libraries and long echoing corridors, suited him. It did not ask for noise. It offered instead space to think, to read, to revisit notes from years past. Pasteur was not nostalgic in the common sense, but he did, from time to time, reread his earliest papers. Not for pride, but to check again what he had once said. He distrusted his memory less than most, but still preferred the comfort of written truth. His notes from the 1850s, yellowing now, bore the hallmarks of his early style: concise, modest, rigorously careful. Margins were often left wide, as if inviting further thought. Diagrams were simple but clear: a curved neck of glass, a diagram of optical activity, the soft contours of a microbe under the lens. These images, once obscure, had become part of science's shared language, and Pasteur, though not boastful, allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. Students passed him in the corridors with respectful nods. Few dared approach unless invited. Those who did speak with him found him lucid, if somewhat slow in speech, and always alert. He asked questions rather than offered advice. He wanted to hear what they were studying, what problems they faced. If he corrected, it was done gently, never with sarcasm, never with authority. Only the suggestion of a different angle, a reminder to test more thoroughly, to observe more patiently. Occasionally, he was invited to attend public ceremonies. He rarely accepted. When he did, it was only if the purpose aligned closely with his values. Celebrations of scholarship, dedications to new laboratories, commemorations of past scientific figures. He did not seek to be honoured, but he understood, with quiet acceptance, that his presence mattered. Among his close circle, conversation remained practical. He discussed developments in bacteriology, exchanged thoughts on water purification, and followed, with cautious optimism, the growing understanding of hygiene in hospitals. He was aware that germ theory, once controversial, was now forming the basis of public health, that his ideas had travelled, taken root, and become tools for others. It pleased him, not with excitement, but with the soft satisfaction of seeing a tree one has planted bear fruit. At home, his family life remained his anchor. Marie, ever steady, kept the household calm and orderly. Their surviving children were grown now, with lives of their own, but visits were frequent, and grandchildren brought quiet joy. Pasteur, though not outwardly playful, would sometimes observe them with a faint smile, offering small remarks, asking questions about their lessons, their drawings, their curiosities. Evenings were quiet. He would sit by the fire, wrapped in a shawl, reading journals by lamplight. His spectacles rested low on his nose, his fingers turning pages with deliberate care. Sometimes he would write notes for a future publication, thoughts he wished to share with colleagues, replies to letters that had accumulated. He received many letters still, from scholars, from heads of state, from rural doctors and grateful families. He read them all. Some were answered with the help of his assistants, others in his own hand. He preferred simplicity, no long preambles, just gratitude, acknowledgement, and encouragement. The world outside the Sorbonne was changing. Electricity lit the streets, trains ran faster, newspapers carried headlines about politics, war, inventions. Pasteur observed these shifts with interest, but not distraction. His concern remained the human body, the causes of illness, the prevention of suffering. He still believed that science must first do no harm, and then, where possible, do quiet good. His legacy, though never a word he used himself, had begun to settle like dust on the mantelpiece, gently, without announcement. Streets bore his name. Schools adopted his principles, laboratories displayed his portrait, but the man himself remained unchanged. He did not collect honours, nor did he speak of legacy. He cared only that the work continue. And so, at the Sorbonne, as the seasons passed gently across the rooftops of Paris, Louis Pasteur carried on, not as a monument, but as a man. A scientist still, in full, though aged and slow. A mind that remained open, inquisitive, and grounded. His thoughts, always, returned to the fundamentals, the need to observe, to record, to doubt gently and then test, to speak plainly, and above all, to believe, not in oneself, but in the process of discovery. In the last years of Louis Pasteur's life, the world around him quickened. Scientific conferences now drew international attendees, laboratories multiplied across continents, and newspapers, those messengers of the modern age, carried headlines about new discoveries on a weekly basis. Yet within the walls of the Institut Pasteur, there was a hush, a sense of slowed time, and at its centre, the figure of an old man, slightly bent, moving through familiar rooms with a careful step. He had ceased most of his experimental work by the early 1890s. The effort, though desired, had become too great. His right hand, though still steady enough for writing, had grown slower, and his strength no longer allowed for prolonged standing. Yet Pasteur did not retreat into idleness. Each morning he dressed as though for a formal appointment, buttoned coat, brushed hat, shoes carefully polished, and took up residence in the modest study at the Institute's corner. There he read, received visitors, and reviewed the work of younger scientists with undiminished interest. The Institute itself had grown into a thriving space for investigation, its laboratories filled with the low murmur of discussion, the clink of glass, and the faint hiss of gas lamps. Men and women of many nations worked there, inspired not just by Pasteur's achievements, but by his method. His insistence on observation, repetition, and honest documentation had become a quiet creed, passed from mouth to ear, from notebook to mind. From his study, Pasteur followed these developments attentively. Assistants would bring in fresh notes, culture samples, or published articles. He would examine them slowly, holding a magnifier to the text if necessary, and ask questions, simple ones, always. Have you repeated it? What were the controls? What might you have missed? His voice, softer now, still carried authority, not because of command, but because of trust. He had become, without design, a kind of lighthouse. His presence steadied the Institute. He needed say little. His manner did the rest. His final scientific concern was hydrophobia, rabies. Though his vaccine had proved effective, he remained unsettled by its limits. He wondered about incubation times, about variants of the virus, about broader applications of attenuation. He could no longer pursue these questions in the lab, but he passed them on with care. Younger researchers, touched by his quiet gravity, took up the torch, not eagerly, but respectfully. At home, his decline was gentle but steady. Marie remained his companion, her own hair now grey, her hands marked by years of writing, assisting and tending. Their days were quiet. Breakfast at 8, a few visitors before noon, time in the study, a brief walk, weather permitting, dinner at 7, always light, a soup, some bread, a glass of wine. Afterwards, reading by lamplight, often side by side. Their conversation was measured, often silent. Words were no longer needed for much. A look, a sigh, a hand resting lightly atop another's. The closeness of two lives joined not just by marriage, but by long collaboration. Pasteur rarely spoke of death, though he knew it approached. He once told Marie, in the hush of an evening, that he felt no fear, only an unfinished curiosity. There were still questions he would have liked to ask, but he trusted that others would ask them and answer them in time. His children and grandchildren visited often. He delighted in their presence, though he was never overly demonstrative. He asked about their studies, their health, their reading. He preferred quiet moments, watching a grandchild sketch or recite a passage from memory. He smiled but rarely laughed. His joy was subdued like a fire burning low but steady. By 1895 his body had grown frail. Walking became difficult. He was confined more often to a chair, and finally to his bed. Even then, he maintained a certain order. His nightstand held a notebook and pencil. His books were kept within reach. Marie read to him daily passages from journals, letters from colleagues, and occasionally pieces of poetry, which he had grown to appreciate more in age. On 28 September 1895, Louis Pasteur died, aged 72. His passing was quiet, no dramatic scenes, no declarations. He slipped away, surrounded by those who had shaped his life and by the papers and instruments that had shaped his work. The silence that followed was deep, but not cold. It was the silence of peace, of work completed with care, of a life lived without haste or display. News of his death travelled swiftly. Tributes came from around the world. Scientists, statesmen, and common people alike paused to reflect. Streets were renamed, schools held vigils, and at the Institut Pasteur, the laboratories paused for a day. Not in grief alone, but in respect. His funeral was held with quiet dignity. No grand procession, no royal trappings. Just colleagues, friends, family, and students. The service, simple and restrained, reflected the man himself. His coffin was carried past the very laboratory in which he had worked, and then, according to his wishes, he was buried in a crypt beneath the institute, a scientist resting beneath the house of his science. The walls of the crypt would later bear mosaics, not of battle or politics, but of discovery. Crystals, flasks, yeasts, the arc of a swan-neck flask, and above all, the calm face of a man looking not into glory, but into truth. And so ended the earthly days of Louis Pasteur, not with noise, but with the gentle closing of a long, quiet chapter, a chapter that left behind not slogans or statues, but methods, not drama, but calm, not conquest, but care. Beneath the Institut Pasteur in Paris, down a flight of quiet stone steps and through a modest arched doorway, lies a crypt. It is not grand in the way of cathedrals or royal tombs. It bears no towering columns nor gilded ornament. Instead, it carries the marks of respect expressed through restraint, mosaics of soft hues, curved lettering in Latin, and a stillness that feels almost like breath held in reverence. Here rests Louis Pasteur. His sarcophagus, carved of pale stone and set gently into the floor, is inscribed not with boasts or titles, but with his name and dates, and a simple tribute to his contribution to science and to mankind. Around him, in the curved walls of the crypt, are quiet depictions of his life's work, rendered in glass and tile. Scenes from the vineyards of Arbois, a boy hunched over a drawing, the delicate arc of a swan-neck flask, a child saved from rabies. Each image formed with the same patient care he brought to his experiments. The crypt remains open to visitors, yet it is never crowded. Scholars and quiet admirers come with bowed heads. Some are students, their shoes soft on the stone floor. Others are elderly, leaning slightly as they pause before the resting place. Some leave flowers, though Pasteur never expressed a need for such gestures. Most simply stand a moment or two in silence. It is not a place for spectacle, but for reflection. The institute above, alive with research, hums with continuity. Generations of scientists have passed through its laboratories, carrying with them the quiet habits Pasteur exemplified: precision, humility, persistence. The microscope has changed. The vocabulary has grown. But the rhythm of inquiry remains much the same. In the decades following his death, Pasteur's influence only deepened. The processes he clarified, fermentation, vaccination, pasteurization, slipped into daily life, becoming so commonplace that their origins began to blur. A bottle of milk, a vial of vaccine, a nurse washing her hands, each an echo of his method, his logic, his calm. Outside France, Institutions were named for him, hospitals, schools, research centres. Yet he never travelled widely in life. His influence extended not through his feet, but through his findings, spread by letters, by translated papers, by those who had sat beside him and learned. In Arbois, his childhood home remains preserved, a small museum now, furnished as it once was. The tanner's tools still hang in quiet array. A desk, not grand, bears the ink stains of study. The air is soft with memory. Visitors walk slowly, speaking in hushed tones, as if entering the pages of a book long closed but never forgotten. And in the wider world, as science marched on, Pasteur's spirit remained embedded, not in declarations, but in the habits of those who observe first, test second, and conclude last. He did not chase fame. He did not speak in sweeping metaphors. He trusted the microscope, the controlled trial, the quiet record of results. He distrusted certainty, preferring evidence, and above all, he believed that science was not for the few, but for all, its fruits to be shared, not hoarded. Those who knew him personally spoke of a man polite but serious. He was not jovial. He did not indulge in long conversations, but he listened carefully, and when he spoke, it was with purpose. He corrected with kindness. He guided with precision. His family, after his death, kept his memory close, but not possessively. They opened the Institute's archives, ensured his notebooks were preserved, and allowed others to learn from his path. They understood, as he had, that legacy is not a statue, but a method passed gently from one hand to the next. The world he helped shape has grown more complex. Viruses tracked by satellites, diseases mapped by genome. Yet the questions he asked remain. What causes this? How can it be seen? What can be done to prevent harm? In those questions lives his spirit. The crypt beneath the Institute remains unchanged. The temperature is cool, the air still. A small lamp burns quietly. Visitors leave with slow steps, often in thought. They do not leave uplifted exactly, but grounded, reminded that progress does not always come in bursts, but in steady work, repeated tests, long hours of observation, and as they return to the light above, to the living laboratories and the bustling corridors of the modern world, they carry with them not just knowledge, but an ethic, a way of looking, a way of being. Louis Pasteur, entombed not in glory, but in gratitude. His life a long, steady breath of care. His memory preserved not in marble alone, but in the milk we drink, the wounds we clean, the vaccines we give, and the science we trust to guide us gently forward.